So again, thanks everyone for introducing themselves. What we'll do today is talk really briefly just about the responsibility for background checks, do a little bit of kind of what are the basic expectations and some how-tos, even given that every state is a little different, and then talk specifically about once all of that is done, how do we document efforts? Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is completing a home study. And so how do we make sure that however the background check process plays out in your case, we're really documenting appropriately so that we can turn in reports that meet the needs of courts, both domestically and internationally. So to advance my slides here. It's not going. Here we go. So the bottom line here is that background checks are really a standard part of home studies, period, throughout the United States and internationally. We are asked to get them. Typically, we ask for criminal background checks and child abuse registry checks. Sometimes they're called the police record, police checks. They can be called by a number of names. But in most cases, individual family members do need to obtain them on themselves. There are some people on the call here who work for adoption agencies and may have the ability to get them directly for families, and that's great and that's super helpful. But anybody who's not from an agency, including ISS, we cannot formally request them on behalf of other people. And so it is something that we need to work with the family to obtain. It's really up to you as an individual professional to determine if you feel comfortable proceeding with the home study without the results of the background checks. Most people do that. But if you have any reservation, or if you work for an agency that has a policy that precludes you from doing that, just let us know. But it is fine if you want to wait to schedule the home study until you have proof that at least the family has submitted for home studies. It's just helpful if you let your case manager know what's going on, because as has been mentioned, that does have an impact on the time. And so it has come up more recently, as I mentioned, about who's responsible. And we always say it is a social work contractor's responsibility to at least get this process started. And couple reasons why. As you've heard, our staff is almost all outside of Melissa, based in Maryland. And we just really can't be experts in how this is done in every state. So we are, through our contracting with you, are really trusting you to be experts in the process, experts in your state. Even if you don't feel like an expert in this area, our intention in working with you is to kind of help get some insight in how things work in your state. I think more importantly, you are in contact with the family. In most cases, we at ISS, including your case manager, is rarely in direct contact with the family on whom you're completing the home study. And so they look to you for questions on the home study process. And so part of your role is to build some of that trust as a professional with the family. Again, even though you can't get physically your hands on those background checks without them, part of your role as an assessor is to kind of build that trust and be a little bit of a resource. Let us know quickly if there is a significant issue with the background checks, or if you're getting pushback, if there's some kind of logistical issue coming up in getting those, so that we can then report back to the requesting agency and let them know what's going on. So the other piece of this, as I mentioned, is that every state really looks different. Some states you can do a lot of the background check searching online. Sometimes there's downloadable forms that need to be completed. Sometimes they need to be notarized. Sometimes you can go to the local police station. And how do I know this? I know this because oftentimes I just Google it. That's really the secret to getting a lot of my information, is just doing a little bit of surfing the internet on how to do it in specific states. And so hopefully doing that research doesn't take a ton of time. I've done it in Maryland. Like I said, it takes, maybe 10 minutes to just kind of organize and figure it out so that we can have the information. I personally, like I said, since I do home studies in Maryland, I just created a cheat sheet for myself. So anytime I'm assigned to do a home study on a family in Maryland, I send this to them. It gives them information on where to download the forms, where they need to go. That's my personal process. Other people send it just in the body of an email or explain it over the phone. Again, the specifics of how you organize it is really up to you, but I do find that having something, like, all it takes is doing the research one time. You have it, you have the links, you have the forms, and then you're ready to go for every subsequent home study that you're working on. We're also happy to keep a copy of that on file so that in the event that your work with the family, you've sent them the information, we get to the end of the process, they still don't have it, we're happy to keep that on file so that if we need to do any other work, we also have that information. It's not required, but happy to start archiving. And then I do want to just emphasize that I think most importantly, one of the things we all need to remember is that background checks are more than just paperwork and a box to check. They really are meant to provide some extra security and information and help us feel more secure about the recommendations that we're making. So we should all want them as part of the home study. And so what I often tell people is, what happens if you come to find out after already submitting your positive recommendation that there is some history that was undisclosed, whether it's something more serious or something more minor. The specific activity that comes up on a background check doesn't necessarily, or certainly doesn't need to be a disqualifier in and of itself. Lots of people have history, but it at least should be explored in conversations with the home study so it can be addressed. I've used examples I've worked with families where there's been a history where a parent had arrest record for participating in peaceful protests. Again, when all we need to do is kind of reference it, talk about it, what it was. We talked about, how he hasn't done that recently, and if he were to participate in more, that he wouldn't involve the kid. So there's all sorts of ways to kind of have that discussion. If there is something more serious, again, I would certainly say having a regular conversation about it is important. And if you don't have that in the background checks, it's a little awkward to send in a report saying that you completely support the recommendation, but haven't actually seen what that history is. Why is this not going? So any questions on that before I continue?
I have a question.
Sure.
Let me turn this back on. So this sort of implies that we can submit a report and a recommendation without first getting the background reports?
Yeah. So one of the things that when we do kind of our initial training with contractors is that, and we'll kind of go through this here in the next steps, that because ISS and by extension are independent contractors, we're not a licensed placement agency. All we're doing through the home study process under these contracts are providing home studies for kinship placement, either through states or through interstate work or through international kinship placements or guardianship placements. So they're not adoptions. So we are able to submit home studies that have a conditional recommendation without receiving background checks. But your question is well taken, and individual contractors can submit the reports, which again, I'll talk about in a minute with these conditional recommendations. But we at ISS, our relationship with the requesting agency typically isn't done until we're able to provide those background checks. And so this is kind of this murky area, and why we're talking today is that we can move ahead with submitting a home study without the physical copies of the background checks so that we're able to pay you for your work. But the home study itself is not considered complete until we have background checks. Does any, yeah, I see Don, you have a hand raised.
Yes, the last home study that I did, or the first home study that I did with you all, the parent was not able to financially pay for a background check. What are the recommendations if that's the case?
Great question. I'm about to get to it in like 2 slides. So hang on to
sorry.
that one. No, that's good. That's
Okay.
good. Any other questions? Maybe I'll keep going, and it sounds like some of the questions might be answered.
Elaine,
Yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to piggyback on something that you just
Please.
mentioned. That, as Elaine said, the home study is not fully completed until the background checks are in. So that's why sometimes the case is complete. Well, in your eyes, the case is completed because you've turned in the home study and the documentation. Then someone will call you back a month or two and be like, we still have not received the background checks. And sometimes we get the response, well, I've finished that. I'm done with that. Yes, you're done with that, but ideally, the home study is not completed until all the documentation is turned in. So like I said, even though you've wrote your report, you submitted your report, you turned in your report, and you've been paid, the case is still open on our desk because we can't complete it. And we're still getting those inquiries about where the background checks. So we'll reach out to you maybe months down the line and say, we still have not received the background checks. And we just ask that you check in with the family to see what has occurred. I know some people will be like, well, I'm done with that, but really not, because it's still not a complete package. I can't, express that more, that it's the home study is still not complete without that documentation. So
does that mean that we need to write an addendum or just send in the reports?
If there's no addendum unless maybe 8 months have passed and we still don't have background checks. And we can just say, okay, so can you document, and I'm quite sure Elaine's going to go into this. Can you document, I don't want to get before myself, can you document your efforts? Because as Elaine said, it is the family's responsibility to get the background checks, and you can't make them, follow through. But we have to be mindful that we should be documenting the efforts we've made to coach them to encouraging to get the background checks completed. Because that may come in handy if the background checks are not completed after an extended period of time. We have to show proof that efforts had been made to do so.
Seems like the placement of a child would be motivation to get those in.
Well, that's ideally, yes, but we would think so, but a lot of times it does not happen. That's not a motivating factor to get them done. People feel as though, and it's for multiple reasons, many reasons that they don't get the background checks done. So, so I just wanted to.
No, that's perfect. And I think I am going to go into more detail on all of that. So I'll keep going, but please keep continuing the conversation and jumping in. So the basic expectations are that families are made aware of this as a standard part of home study from the beginning. And then to your point, Deborah, that failure to provide background checks may result in delays or difficulties in placement. So that it can be very much impressed upon them that The home study interview is one component, but if they don't get the background checks, a state or a country may not be willing to place the child. And so that piece is on them. And that, again, that is part of the complete package, and that should, in many cases, be a motivating factor, but we know from experience that it's not the case always. We do ask that this is explained kind of during that first call when you get the case from Felicia, or Felicia contacts you and then your case manager sends you the case note. When you make that first call, explaining that as part of the process at the very beginning just helps it move forward. The second piece of the expectation is that they should receive some just basic instructions or information on how to get them. And so if you're talking to a family and you say, part of the home study is part of the requirements of a home study is that you get a criminal background check and a child abuse registry check. And if they say, well, I don't know how to do that, that's where you come into, just like I said, in an email or a quick document, just to send them a link, quick instructions on how to do it. You don't have to go with them. You don't have to be on the phone with them, but kind of just explain in basic terms how to go about getting that. Copies of those results. So one of the questions that often comes up, because states often have different categories of requesting background checks. In many states, you are allowed to request a background check on yourself. And so that's what we tell people to do. And in that case, copies of those results can be sent directly to them. And then they can send a copy to you. If you do work for an agency, they can be sent directly to the agency if you're able to get them directly through an agency, great, but we know that's not the case for most people. In cases where the state, you're not allowed to request on yourself, which I think, I don't know if anyone is in one of those states, but results can be sent directly to us, though it's really important that if that's the route we go, that at least your case manager's name is on that, because if we get a background check on somebody, the people who check the mail in our office are going to have no idea who it goes to. So it creates some additional delays if they're sent directly to our office, unless there's kind of a real thoughtfulness around putting the case number and the case name on that application. But it is an option. And I'll talk about that in a second too. And then, like I said, that make sure the families know the expectation they need to provide a copy of the background check so that you can finalize your recommendation, and so that we can ourselves send those copies to the requesting agency. We know that there are some frustrating limitations in this. Again, I think that's why a lot of people are on the call. As contractors, we can't directly obtain that information many times. And so therefore it is the responsibility of the family to do that. So it's a piece of control that we don't have. Cost, as Donna mentioned, is, there is a cost almost always associated with getting background checks. The costs vary state to state. And when there's multiple adults living in the home, it can add up. And then finally, that not all families, despite the potential motivating factor of placement of a child in their home, are particularly quick at getting these done. Some states you can fill a lot of it out just online, but a lot of the times you need to go get fingerprinted. Sometimes you need to get it notarized. A lot of people don't have printers at home. So there are some things that kind of stack up and make the process of getting them feel more time consuming, and then therefore create some delays. So a little bit to kind of drill down on some of those, the access piece. So like I said, the best way to get them, I think the fastest, and I'll let my colleagues jump in if they feel otherwise, is to have the person request them background checks to themselves and then send a copy to their worker. That way they can also send a copy to us or their child's social worker, and they can just have a copy on file for themselves if they need it for something else. So that seems to be the best option. Like I said, if you're working on an interstate case, they can have them sent directly to the child's caseworker. We'll just make sure we get a copy of them directly there. And then also it can be sent care of the case manager that you're working with. So if you are working on a case with Melissa, and the family can't get a copy of their background check sent directly to their house, you can ask that they fill out the form with our office address and then care of Melissa Aguilar. But again, if it just says ISS-USA, it's going to take extra time for our office staff to figure out exactly who needs to get that copy. And then for certainly anybody who's working as an independent contractor should not offer to receive results at anybody's personal address. That goes without saying, but we do need to make sure that you have a copy of the official results. A note about costs, like Dawn said, if you're able to get them on your own and include it in a quote, we can work that into our scope of work with you, but we can't reimburse costs without prior approval and without having that discussion up front. Our typical process historically has always been that the cost is something that the family has to take on their own. If there are really extenuating circumstances, we sometimes have the ability to reimburse. I think in 6 years I've done that one time. In order to do that, the family will need to send us a W-9 form, which includes the social security number of the person being reimbursed. So it's not an easy process to reimburse. It also, most states, when you're submitting for a background check, you need to submit the payment with that request. And when it's us paying, as you all know, who get paid by us, it takes a couple of weeks at least to get that check out. So it really only makes sense for the family to pay that fee. In my experience, it rarely costs more than like $25 a person. So I think if the family does express financial difficulty paying the fee, there's a couple things. Definitely communicate that to your case manager so she knows that that's an issue and she can communicate that to the child's worker. The family themselves can talk to the child's worker about it and express their concerns about the financial burden. It also should trigger a larger conversation about their overall financial status, because if the financial burden of paying for background checks truly is a burden for them, I mean, certainly nobody wants to pay it, but adding a child to your home is expensive. And so if the cost of background checks is really a burden, there definitely needs to be further conversation about the family's kind of financial situation, and to think about that, because it's just, again, it's one of these questions where it's just a standard expectation. So we can try and work with you on it, but at the end of the day, almost always the family is still asked to pay. In an international case, if the international agency is really gung-ho about paying for all of the costs and they want to pay for the cost, again, that's something we can talk about. It's not been my experience, but unfortunately, it just is something that the family is asked to pay. And I don't know if anyone else on my team has thoughts on that or experiences or wants to weigh in on dealing with some of the situations where cost has been a burden in the past, if others have experience with that. We'll keep on. So then the last piece, kind of related to the leisureliness note around how to get this moving. The timeline that I personally suggest to people is that you discuss this requirement with families when you, like I said, when you first make that introductory call. If you're willing to then proceed with interviews before you get those results, definitely follow up on the status of that during your home study interview. Hopefully they have some results by then, or at least can confirm that they're being processed. And then, you know, you write the report, you're staying in touch with them, you're getting whatever else you need. If you've completed writing your report and you still have not received copies of background checks, I would follow up again one final time, let them know that you'll submit your report with a conditional recommendation until background checks are received. And that's meant to also, for anybody who hasn't gone through the process, spur them a little bit so they know that the recommendation is conditional until we have those final background checks. And this gets to what I think Katrina was saying earlier, that if background checks truly are taking 6-8 months, which, gosh, that's a long time, we don't feel comfortable holding back your payment for that amount of time, given how much we know, you know, the actual interview process and writing the report takes. And so that is why we're able to kind of move forward with a conditional recommendation on these, is so that background checks, which are completely out of your control in most cases, are not what's standing between, you know, is not getting in the way of your payment. But as Katrina said, there's still work to be done if they aren't received. And I will say too, if you personally feel uncomfortable submitting any kind of report until background checks are received, that's also your prerogative. That's something we will communicate with the requesting agency. And so once again, that's a conversation you should have with the case manager regularly. I was trying to find exceptions, and I realized earlier only one. And I don't know if others have more, please chime in, but some people do for their professional work need regular background checks for employment. You know, I'm thinking of other social workers or people in mental health professions, teachers, nurses. You know, we've had people say that they need to get them for their own employment. And so if they can get copies of their existing background checks from their employer, from whomever, then, you know, they don't have to redo it unless it's expired. And as long as we have copies. We've had people say to us that they don't want to get background checks because they're in some kind of really high, you know, their employment offers them a really high clearance, if they work for the government, if they, you know, need to go through an even more intense background check process for their employment, that like by virtue of proving their employment in that sector where they have a security clearance, it should be obvious that they have no criminal history. I get that argument, but we've found it's really not enough proof, and that we need some kind of physical copy of paper, of official documentation that shows a clear background check. Which I know I've done home studies with folks who have had military positions and all this, and it's awkward to be like, nope, you still have to get me a background check from Maryland, but that's just how it works. Unless, you know, if the requesting agency says they don't need it, they said they don't need it, but that hasn't been my experience.
What do you mean by outdated? You know, within a year?
Yeah, I think usually we say it's within a year.
Excuse me.
Bless you. And we can talk about that too when we go into the documentation piece, because, you know, it's the kind of thing where if you're doing a home study in June of 2022 and somebody's like, oh man, I just did this last year because like I was whatever, like volunteering at a camp, but it was done in like June 2020 or June 2021. it's a pretty good chance that like there's not a lot of criminal history in the following year. So you can work that into your recommendation, that you've seen a copy of the 2021. We can ask the requesting agency if that would suffice, but typically we'll say they should be valid within a year. That's kind of the standard, the industry standard. As for the documentation, so remember, and I know we're kind of squeaky wheels on this, that our primary role here is not to approve or reject. We're not licensed to do that. Our job is to be assessors, and in that role, our main job is to be documenters. So we're documenting what we observe, what we hear about, kind of the impressions we have from the interviews with in the home, and then to also document all of those sufficiently in a home study document. So if you have, if you've explained to the family this whole process, that they need to get background checks, you've given them the basic information, you followed up a couple of times, really you have done all you can do in your job. But you also need to document that, because if it's nowhere written in the home study that you've made those efforts, we don't assume that you have, even though we'd like to think everybody has. So we just need to make sure that that's fully listed out in the report. So again, if it's not stated what the efforts have been, nobody is going to have the expectation that it was necessarily done. You'll see if you use our template, which I think many of you do, there is a whole section on criminal history in there. So again, it shouldn't be a totally new idea for people that they have to get background checks, because it is here in our template. And it says to obtain a formal background check, but here's where you can have those conversations. So whether or not you have the results back, you can still fill this out and kind of ask these general questions about criminal history. Again, this is an opportunity for families to disclose anything that will eventually come out. So usually I'll say, like, I'm gonna ask these questions. We do need you to still go and get a formal background check, but this is an opportunity for you to tell me what I might see on there. So again, these are pretty simple, just check boxes, but you can fill that out based on their verbal responses if you don't have a full police check. All right, and then here's where we get to what we mean by some of the documentation language. So if you don't have the results back by the time you're submitting your report, and you've talked to them about it, you've reminded them, you followed up, again, all we really need to do at this stage in order for you to submit a report is to document those efforts. So you can use language like this, and I'll send this around as well so people have it. But that you can state that no criminal child abuse history was disclosed during the interview process, that you as the assessor, or however you refer to yourself in the report, provided the family with instructions on how to obtain them, on what dates. That's really helpful to be really specific in how you're doing this, and that at the time results have not been received. As simple as that is fine. You can be more specific if you know what's going on with the family and talk about why they haven't, if cost is a barrier, if I don't know, if there's other things that are going on that are specifically getting in the way of accessing those background checks, please write them. You can also be a little bit more potentially descriptive or colorful or qualitative in your description, and talk about that so-and-so already has a security clearance, so that you don't expect that there be concerns for his background, but you're still waiting, or that background checks that were received a year ago have no criminal record, so you don't expect that there be, but you're still waiting on an update, something like that. Or the alternative, if you are a little concerned, and if this, if it's you're having trouble getting background checks and having trouble getting just general good engagement from the family, that the lack of background check may be in addition to other concerns that you have, and that's fine to include that in your recommendation about potential concerns for the family's ability to follow through with requirements and have responsibility for the undertaking they have of taking the placement of the child. And then finally, I think we've shared, and we did a session a couple months ago about how to write recommendations. And so the conditional recommendation is one category of recommendation we have, where we just ask that if you don't have the background checks received, that you make note of that, and that the recommendation is conditional upon receipt of complete background checks. There's a few different ways to say it, again, all based on the distinct circumstances of the case you're working on, but please do make it conditional if you don't have strong assurance that the background check is clear.